Let's get you up and running for part 2 here. All right, now we're looking at the other half of this. We're looking at the idea of cardiac output and stroke volume more specifically. So, what determines stroke volume? What determines the amount of blood pumped out per ventricular contraction? Well, I know that the equation is SV equals EDV minus ESV. But what determines EDV? What determines how much blood is in that ventricle at the beginning of a contraction? Well, one of the ideas then is what's called venous return, right? That's the blood flow, right? Coming in from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava and your little pathetic coronary sinus in the back of the heart. Well, what's really influencing how much blood can come into the inferior and superior vena cavas is what's called filling time, which really translates into heart rate. Your heart rate will influence how much blood gets into the atrium, which then means how much is going to get into the ventricles. So let's look at this in terms of duration of filling time for the ventricles. I'm going to walk you through a little analogy. So let's say I've got, here's my heart, and here's my ventricle, it's contracted, here it's relaxed. And imagine I'm going along an assembly line, and there's this pipe that'll fill my heart full of beer. Okay? I've got a pipe here, and a pipe here, and a pipe here, and a pipe here. So the longer I am under the spigot, right, the more beer I get. But it's also how long I keep my chamber open. So I could stay here all day closed and beer's pouring down, I get none of it. But if I open up the valve, I can fill the heart full of blood or full of beer. So the longer this is open, the more I have time to fill the ventricle up. Now, let's look at this under 3 different scenarios to see if this makes sense. The effect on heart rates with EDV. Now, compared to normal, let's slow the heart rate down. Let's allow for the ventricle to be open for a longer period of time compared to normal. Does it make sense that I have more time to fill? If I have more time to fill, what happens to EDV? It goes up. Boom. I've just increased EDV. Now, if that makes sense compared to normal, that the longer it's open or the slower the heart rate, the more time for filling, then the complete opposite should be understandable as well. Being so fast that you have very little time to open. That means I have very little time to fill that ventricle full of blood. If I have very little time, my EDV should do what? It should go down, right? So let's do the very fast one down below in green. A very fast heart rate leads for a decrease in EDV, but a very slow heart rate leads for an increase in EDV. Well, those two make sense compared to normal. But a faster heart rate, if the faster my heart beats, then the less time there is for filling. How can I have a fast heart rate leading to an increase in EDV? It's because you're exercising. What does that really mean? Those of you that had lab already, the concept we talked about called the musculoskeletal pump comes into play. Whenever you contract muscles, right, you're pushing the blood up the inferior vena cava if you're working your lower extremities. If you're working the uppers, then you're pushing blood through the muscles down the superior vena cava. In a sense, you're basically doing fuel injection. You're no longer pouring the blood in like a pipette. You're squeezing it in with a pastry bag. That compensates for the faster heart rate. Yeah, heart rate's faster, but now I'm pushing the blood in. That would give me a larger EDV. So now we have 3 ways of influencing EDV based upon heart rate. I can have a nice slow heart rate that leads for more time to get a larger EDV. An exceptionally fast heart rate, less time for filling, a less EDV. Or I could be, hiking and walking up or bike riding or jogging. And that increase in heart rate is also accompanied by contractions of skeletal muscles, which help push the blood into my heart, acting like fuel injection. Therefore, I have a larger EDV. There's two ways to raise it and one way to lower it. So we'll be okay with that? Okay, now let's see what we can do with that. Now, let's pause for a second. I think we mentioned beer too much. You're going to go get some. Let's go back to one of the factors that influences heart rate for a minute. They call it the atrial reflex. I want to stress this. Now, those of you that never had me before, when I stress something, my former 241s, what does that mean? It's going to show up on the test. Okay? I'm hinting strongly. If the atrial reflex, right, was about atrial stretch leading to an increase in heart rates, Frank Starling is about an increase in stroke volume, not heart rates. Make that first mental connection. Right? The Frank Starling principle deals with an increase in stroke volume, not changes in heart rate. Once I get that down, I need to understand, well, how does it lead to a change in stroke volume? It deals with EDV, the end diastolic volume. Let's take our little heart over here and do two scenarios. Let's say this is a normal heart rate, and let's say that's going to be 70 mils of blood. No, I'm sorry, not 70. I'm thinking of the wrong thing here. 135 milliliters of blood, right? That's my normal EDV, right? Now, what if I allow for a slower heart rate? That leads to a larger EDV, right? Imagine the left ventricle like you did the atrium, like a balloon. If you put more air into the balloon, it's going to stretch out, right? Well, now we're getting stretched. So here's an increase in EDV, making my ventricle larger. So now maybe my EDV, let's make it 150 mils instead. Now there's more blood in there. I have more stretch too, don't I? All right? Now, as I'm learning this, I say, all right, I know for the atrial reflex, more stretch sends a signal to the medulla, sympathetic nervous system, norepinephrine, faster heart rate. But this is a mechanical adjustment, no autonomic nervous system involved. Now we need to pause and tap into a cobweb. From 241, in what determines the force of a skeletal muscle contraction, I'm hoping I know what 241s were exposed to, the concept of the length of the muscle and its ability to produce force relationship. As you had short muscle cells and long muscle cells, you had amount of force on the y-axis, so force was increasing as I go up the y, and the muscle cells getting longer as I go along the x-axis, and overall the basic force plot kind of looks something like this, and we had this optimum range running right down the middle. So I realized from 241 that this following statement is not accurate. This is accurate, bless you. Okay. Now, inaccurate. The longer the muscle cell becomes, the greater amount of force it can produce. Is not correct. Because I realized that after I pass this optimum range, my alignment of in my sarcomeres, of myosin to actin, got less and less efficient. There were fewer and fewer myosins able to grab actin. So of course, the longer I get, the less ability I have to produce force. If that doesn't ring a bell, you need to look at between now and, let's say, Saturday. And if you're really screwed, I can walk through to you on Saturday in the lab. Here's the cool thing about cardiac tissue. This is the plot for cardiac. Now I can say the longer the muscle cell becomes, the greater the force. Which means that your cardiac muscle cells are already aligned in such an inefficient way that the more blood that comes in, the more efficient they become. Which means I can create more force. If I can create more force, stroke volume goes up. I can pump out more blood per contraction. So let's go back to the beginning here in a second, give you a second to write that down. All right, so the devil's in the details. All right, what do I mean by this? All right, A causes B, which causes C, which causes D, which means B excruciatingly detailed. All right, A, venous return. All right, more blood into the left ventricle caused an increase in stretch. Right, that increase in stretch caused a more efficient alignment of the cardiac muscle cells, which led to more force, which led to a larger stroke volume.
Does it get more efficient because they're branched and as they stretch out they become more like perpendicular to each other?
Yeah, well, a little bit, yes. The branching is more about the ability to propagate the electrical signal through the tissues. But that's also kind of a similar pattern to the way smooth muscle cells are aligned. So there's a little bit of to that. I would go more for the ability to propagate signals rather than the other idea, but there's some truth to it, yes. Okay? So, as blood goes into the left ventricle, EDV increases, right? That causes more stretch. That more stretch causes better alignment. I can create more force. That is the Frank-Starling principle. Realize you're not using any of the autonomic nervous system to do this. It is a pure mechanical alignment issue. But the atrial reflex was all about the autonomic nervous system in response to stretch. It wasn't about efficiency of cells in the atria. You want to be able to separate those two out, right? Understand the sequence of A to B to C. In other words, give me a nice, good, linear concept map. Now, this will cause that, and therefore that would cause this. This will then cause that, and that then causes this. Okay? That might be a 5-point question on page 3. I don't know, you know? All right? But now there is a limit, right? If I can find my little toy here. Those of you that had the pericardial stack, and we're going to do hearts again on Wednesday once they get thawed out for us. But I had to play tug of war with that pericardial stack, right? Realize how unstretchable that is? So if my heart's getting bigger and bigger, filling with blood, there is a limit to how much stretch I can get. So this isn't go for infinity. Your heart, we think, is designed to do about 500 beats a minute. That's like its mechanical stress. All right? There's no way you're going to do 500 beats a minute and be alive. Right? After about 240, you're in a hurt and trouble. Right? But structurally, it's designed to handle a lot more stress than we have to go for. Okay? So once you get through with this, you summarize the idea of the atrial and summarize the idea then of Frank-Starling. Look at the differences between them. One involves autonomic, one involves mechanical alignment with them. Right? But it is affecting stroke volume. Now, let's do ESV, the other part of my stroke volume equation. Preload. Preload is the stretch, right? It's sort of like if you have an air gun and you're pumping the gun full of air before you shoot the trigger, right? You're preloading the chamber with air pressure. Preloading is the amount of stretch in that chamber. But what causes more stretch? More blood. Whether it's in the atria or the ventricle, it simply means more venous return, means more preload. Now, let's look at Frank-Starling and use the words preload this time. So I know blood will end up in my left ventricle. That blood I can call venous return, right? Because it did come from the venous system. It hasn't quite entered the arterial system yet. But I can also refer to it as either EDV or the amount of stretch or the amount of preload. It's the same thing. The amount of stretch is the amount of preload. Because we're preloading before the contraction. So the more blood that comes in, the more preload we have, the more forceful my contraction will be. So the more preload there is, the stronger your contraction is, the greater the amount of force you create. Now, if you think about our normal equation of EDV minus ESV, it would be 135, that's a lot of 5, minus 65, right? That would give me 70 mils for a stroke volume. If, however, our preloads became 150 instead, right, I've got more blood, which means my stroke volume is going to be larger. But how much is left over is also lower than normal. You're going to have less than normal in here because of the more preload. Because more preload causes a greater contractility, causes a greater contraction. So maybe our preload will be, so let's make it 55 instead. So here we're 15 units higher than normal, right? And we're also 10 units less. That's 25 units more. Your stroke volume will now be 95 milliliters. And get out of the way here. Here's a nice little simple way of thinking about it. More blood in means more blood out and less left over, which means ESD is going to be smaller than normal. So if EDD goes up, ESD will go down. If there's more blood at the beginning, I'm going to have less left over at the end. Right? If it's more in the beginning, I'll have less in the end. Why does that make sense? Well, more in the beginning causes more stretch. Now we're talking about Frank Starling. More stretch, better alignment, more force is stronger contraction. It means more blood gets pumped out, and I'll have less left over. Right? Those should make good sense after a day or two, if need be, of hashing it out and kind of gnawing on that bone. So if EDD goes up, ESD goes down. But what would cause for an increase in ESD? Well, this thing called afterload. Now, I didn't invent the words. Preload is about stretch. And you would kind of think if there's a load in the word afterload, it deals with stretch too. It's about pressure. Afterload is about resistance. And let's draw a little picture of that resistance for afterload. All right. Let's draw a really big aorta. Draw a little dotted line so we can see where we're coming into. And there's our septum. Put a little valve there. There's my valve there. Valve there. And there's my semilunar valve right there. And we'll have green blood. You've got blood pushing against the walls of your blood vessels, right? That creates blood pressure. I know that this is a semilunar valve, right? I know it's a one-way valve. Which way is it one way for? For blood to go back in or blood to go back out? It's designed to let blood go from here into there. So if the blood tries to push this way, I'm going to be sealing that valve shut, right? Right? Well, there's a certain amount of force of that blood. There's blood pressure pushing against that semilunar valve. That happens to be 80, that's not showing up too well. That's better. 80 millimeters of mercury. Pushing down, so we'll make a little 80 right here. 80 units of force pushing against that door. That'd be like me having one of you guys stand outside that door and push it like with 10 pounds of force, some kind of force that I have to overcome to get the door to open. So if this is afterload, afterload is resistance. Well, who has to overcome that resistance? The left ventricle does. So afterload is the amount of force the left ventricle needs to create to open up the aortic semilunar valve. The amount of force the left ventricle needs to create to open up the aortic semilunar valve, or aortic valve. And we'll come back to that in a second. Let's go back to here. Oh, aortic valve opens. At what amount of pressure? 80 millimeters. Holy crap. It lines up, right? And there's my isovolemic contraction. Well, how does isovolemic contraction deal with opening my aortic valve? Well, if afterload is the force of the blood pushing against that semilunar valve, in other words, afterload is an amount of blood pressure keeping that valve closed. Then we said that, well, we can think of afterload as resistance, or in other words, the amount of force the left ventricle has to overcome to pop open that door. Does that make sense? Okay, now, you got to think about this in 3 different ways. The cardiac cycle is 800 milliseconds in duration, right? 8/10 of a second. I've got 3 things I've got to do in those 8/10. I need to fill my chambers of blood. I need to begin to contract to build up pressure to overcome afterload. I need to eject my blood. So I got to fill, build pressure, and eject. Under normal conditions, I will do that in 800 milliseconds. I have a certain amount of filling time. I have time to go through isovolemic contraction to build the pressure up, and then time to pop the door open and eject the blood out. Right? And if 80 milliliters of mercury is our normal afterload, even though it was 10, it would still be considered afterload. What would happen if all of a sudden afterload, I don't have toys, were to go from being 80 to a squeaky 100? Has afterload increased?
Yes.
Has the resistance increased?
Yes.
Does the left ventricle have to create more pressure than normal to open up the semilunar valve?
Yes.
But it takes time to build the pressure. You have to rob Paul to pay Peter. You can either do one of 2 things. I can allow for less filling time, so I have more time to build up pressure, or I can try and build the pressure up faster. Because I still want to do a cardiac output of 5 liters a minute. I got to do something to maintain that 5 liters a minute of homeostasis. So if I have an increase in diastolic blood pressure, my heart has to work harder to maintain a normal cardiac output, because I have more resistance to overcome. So the cardiologist says, we don't want your heart to work harder, we want it to work smarter. So I'm going to do one of 2 things to cause a drop in your blood pressure. They give you diuretics, which we'll learn about in the renal system, maybe a thiazide, or give you a vasodilator to drop your systemic blood pressure. Maybe give you an alpha blocker or a calcium blocker. He wants to turn this back into that. Because if this pressure can lessen, it can lower, then afterload lowers. If afterload lowers, the heart doesn't have to work as hard to pump the blood out. Right? So now, if I'm experiencing afterload, and I'm doing one of 3 things, I'm filling my chamber, I'm building pressure up, I'm actually ejecting the blood. With a higher amount of afterload, I'm going to try and maintain the same filling time, but just contract harder. If I contract harder, I'm not going to maybe have a larger stroke volume, because a good amount of that time is going to be used to try and overcome that resistance. So since I'm spending more time contracting, I'm going to actually have to steal from my filling time after all. I'll have less time to fill. You can kind of think of it like this. We go back to this little diagram, which I should probably put a couple of copies of it in the notes and then keep going back and forth to it. Here is pressure being built to overcome afterload. if we could somehow overlap time with this, if now all of a sudden afterload caused me to build up this much pressure to maybe about here instead, then my arch would come to about to here, and then come all the way down here to my ESV value. Because I would have less time to fill. I'm spending more time building up pressure. So what this is getting to then is that if afterload increases, ESV will also change. ESV will go up if afterload goes up. If there's an increase in resistance, I'll get an increase in how much blood is left over. I had to spend more time building up pressure. If afterload goes up, ESV goes up. What happens if afterload goes down? Then ESV goes up or down. Goes down, there's less left over because I have to overcome less resistance. All right, so what causes afterload to change? It's your diastolic pressure. For whatever reason, if diastolic pressure changes, so does afterload. Because that's what it is. It is a measurement of resistance. That's why when you have your blood pressure, it's the idea of, I think the last time I had mine, it was 127/75. It ain't bad at 56 years of age, right? But that's the resistance that my heart has to overcome to get that valve open to pump the blood through. And that's the in-between beats pressure, right? That is like the, I hate the word dynamic. I'm sorry, the word static. Because static means unchanging. It actually goes through a big arch of change. But this is the in-between heartbeat pressure. That is my afterload. Remember what number that is? That is afterload. This is all the lecture. Yes?
So if you have a really low afterload, does that mean it's harder for, like, because you said earlier, I think on Monday, when you have 65 milliliters left over in your heart, and you do something like really quickly.
Right.
So if you have a higher afterload, does that mean or a lower afterload, does that mean you can't do things really quickly because you don't have leftover ESP?
No, what it usually means then is that if you have a lower afterload, you'll have a slower heart rate, and perhaps then to maintain a normal cardiac output, you'll accompany that slower heart rate with a stronger contraction. So that if cardiac output is one of two things, heart rate and stroke volume, if heart rate goes down, SV must go up to maintain the same value of cardiac output. So, and this is a really complicated concept. There are a lot of, well, it could be that, and it could be something totally different, which makes cardiology so kind of cool in that sense. We're not going to go through this slide. This is for you to work through. But it says everything we just talked about in kind of a concept map. All you got to do is just kind of read the idea. For example, here's afterload, right? If the afterload increases, what happens to ESV? It increases. Cool, I got that. But now, can you tell me why? That's what you're going to want to be able to do with this. First, can you agree with it? And then, can you fill in the whys? And if you can, it means you truly understand what this is talking about. Unless you realize that up here, FT is filling time, you can translate that into heart rate. And they're kind of missing something here. I can agree with that a really fast heart rate, right? I'll get increase in EDV as long as I have exercise with that. But a really fast filling time could actually lead to a drop in EDV, right? Because I've got not enough time at all to actually fill the chambers up. So they didn't completely fill this up as accurately as I gave you the description in the lecture notes. But overall, you can be able to go through and make sure that this makes sense and that makes sense. Oh, shoot. No more learning. Okay. So, write it down. This is where it's going to be really important. Do two things. First of all, divide it into half the lecture about things that alter heart rates. Learn it one slide at a time. And talk about each slide and does it make sense. Then divide it into stroke volume. One thing at a time. Does it make sense? Do I truly understand what afterload is? Do I truly understand what Frank Starling's principle is compared to atrial reflex? Do I understand the mechanism, how things do what they do? Right? Work on those. If you have any questions, let's address those at the very beginning of Wednesday. And if you haven't quite gotten to it yet, then we can address them when you come open lab on Saturday. I'm sorry, say that again. It's going to only try and beat 70 mils, given some other abnormality not taking place. Yeah. All right, does it have labs? Give me about 10 minutes. If you want a picture of the whiteboard, take it out. Tell one to erase it.